In the heart of Washington, D.C., where power and corruption often walk hand in hand, a scandal was brewing that would soon send shockwaves through the political elite. It was a story of greed, betrayal, and an audacious heist that would leave even the most seasoned investigators stunned. At the center of this tale was a young, unassuming intern named Ethan Cole, who had managed to pull off the unthinkable, stealing $7 million from one of the most powerful and corrupt politicians in the city, Senator Richard Holloway. Ethan Cole was a 22-year-old graduate student at Georgetown University, studying political science with dreams of one day making a difference in the world. He had landed what many would consider a dream internship in Senator Holloway's office. To the outside world, Holloway was a charismatic and respected figure, a man who had spent decades in public service, championing causes that resonated with the American people. But behind closed doors, Holloway was a different man altogether. He was a master manipulator, a politician who had built his empire on a foundation of bribes, kickbacks, and illicit deals. His wealth was vast, but it was also hidden, stashed away in offshore accounts and shell companies, far from the prying eyes of the IRS and federal investigators. Ethan's journey into the heart of Holloway's corruption began innocently enough. As an intern, his duties were mundane, fetching coffee, organizing files, and answering phones. But Ethan was sharp, observant, and ambitious. He quickly realized that there was more to Holloway's office than met the eye. He noticed the constant stream of high-powered lobbyists and businessmen who came and went at all hours, the hushed conversations that stopped the moment he entered the room, and the cryptic emails that Holloway would delete immediately after reading. One evening, as Ethan was working late, he stumbled upon something that would change everything. Holloway had left his computer unlocked, and Ethan, curious and perhaps a bit reckless, began to dig through the files. What he found was a treasure trove of incriminating evidence, bank statements, wire transfer records, and documents detailing Holloway's involvement in a massive money laundering scheme. The amounts were staggering, with millions of dollars flowing through offshore accounts and into Holloway's pockets. Ethan's initial shock quickly turned to anger. He had idolized Holloway, believing him to be a man of integrity and principle. But now, faced with the cold, hard evidence of Holloway's corruption, Ethan felt betrayed. He knew he had to do something, but what? Going to the authorities was risky. Holloway had powerful allies, and Ethan had no proof that wouldn't be dismissed as the ramblings of a disgruntled intern. No, if he was going to expose Holloway, he would need to be smarter, more cunning. It was then that Ethan hatched a plan so audacious that it bordered on insanity. He would steal Holloway's money. Not all of it, of course, that would be impossible. But enough to hurt him, to make him feel the sting of betrayal that Ethan had felt. And so, over the next few weeks, Ethan began to meticulously plan his heist. He studied Holloway's routines, learned the passwords to his accounts, and even managed to gain access to the senator's private safe. He knew that one wrong move could mean the end of his career, his freedom, and possibly his life. But Ethan was determined. He would take Holloway's dirty money and use it to expose the truth. The night of the heist was a blur of adrenaline and fear. Ethan waited until the office was empty, then made his way to Holloway's private office. He bypassed the security system with ease, a trick he had learned from a tech-savvy friend, and opened the safe. Inside was a stack of cash, gold bars, and a ledger detailing Holloway's illicit transactions. Ethan took the cash and the ledger, leaving the gold behind. He knew that the ledger was the key to exposing Holloway's corruption, but he also knew that he couldn't do it alone. He needed help, someone who could navigate the treacherous waters of DC politics and ensure that the truth came to light. As Ethan made his way out of the office, he couldn't help but feel a sense of exhilaration. He had done it. He had taken $7 million from one of the most powerful men in the country. But as he disappeared into the night, he knew that the real challenge was just beginning. Holloway would stop at nothing to get his money back, and Ethan would need to stay one step ahead if he was going to survive. The next morning, the office was in chaos. Holloway arrived to find his safe open and his money gone. He was furious, but also terrified. The ledger was missing, and with it, the evidence of his crimes. He knew that if it fell into the wrong hands, his career, and his freedom would be over. He immediately called in his most trusted aides, ordering them to find the thief and recover the ledger at any cost. But Holloway was not the only one looking for Ethan. The FBI had been investigating Holloway for months, and when they caught wind of the theft, they saw an opportunity to finally bring him down. Special Agent Claire Bennett was assigned to the case. A seasoned investigator with a reputation for being relentless, Claire had spent years chasing corrupt politicians, only to see them slip through her fingers time and time again. But this time was different. This time, she had a lead, a young intern who had disappeared with $7 million and a ledger that could blow the case wide open. Claire knew that finding Ethan Cole was the key to bringing down Holloway, but she also knew that Holloway's people would be looking for him too. It was a race against time, and the stakes couldn't be higher. As Claire began her investigation, she quickly realized that Ethan was no ordinary thief. He was smart, resourceful, and motivated by something more than greed. She dug into his background, interviewing his friends, professors, and former employers. What she found was a young man who had always been driven by a sense of justice, a man who had once dreamed of making a difference in the world. Claire couldn't help but feel a sense of admiration for Ethan, even as she hunted him down. She knew that if she could find him, she could use him to take down Holloway. But she also knew that Holloway's people would stop at nothing to silence him. Meanwhile, Ethan was on the run, moving from one safe house to another, always looking over his shoulder. He knew that Holloway's people were after him, and he knew that he couldn't trust anyone. But he also knew that he couldn't do this alone. He needed an ally, someone who could help him navigate the dangerous world he had stumbled into. And so, he reached out to the one person he thought he could trust, a journalist named Sarah Mitchell, who had made a name for herself by exposing corruption in DC. Sarah was skeptical at first. She had heard stories like this before, whistleblowers who turned out to be frauds, conspiracies that fell apart under scrutiny. But there was something about Ethan's story that rang true. She agreed to meet him, and when she did, she knew that he was the real deal. The ledger he had stolen was a smoking gun, a detailed account of Holloway's crimes that could bring down not just the senator, but an entire network of corrupt politicians and businessmen. Together, Ethan and Sarah began to piece together the puzzle, uncovering a web of corruption that reached far beyond Holloway. But as they dug deeper, they also drew the attention of Holloway's allies, who would stop at nothing to protect their interests. The stakes were higher than ever, and the danger was growing by the day. Ethan knew that he was running out of time, and that if he was going to expose the truth, he would need to act fast. As the first act of this high-stakes drama came to a close, the pieces were in place for a confrontation that would shake the foundations of power in Washington, D.C. Ethan Cole, the young intern who had dared to steal from a corrupt politician, was now at the center of a battle that would determine not just his fate, but the fate of the entire city. And as the FBI closed in, and Holloway's allies prepared to strike, one thing was clear: this was only the beginning. The tension in Washington, D.C. was palpable as the hunt for Ethan Cole intensified. Senator Richard Holloway's inner circle was in a state of panic. The missing $7 million was bad enough, but the absence of the ledger, a meticulous record of bribes, offshore accounts, and illicit deals, was catastrophic. Holloway's allies, a network of powerful lobbyists, businessmen, and even other politicians, were scrambling to contain the fallout. They knew that if the ledger became public, it wouldn't just be Holloway's career that would end, it would be theirs too. Meanwhile, Special Agent Claire Bennett was closing in on Ethan. Her investigation had led her to a series of safe houses across the city, each one abandoned just hours before she arrived. Ethan was proving to be a formidable adversary, but Claire was relentless. She had spent years chasing corrupt politicians, only to see them slip through her fingers. This time, she was determined to succeed. She knew that Ethan was the key to bringing down Holloway, but she also knew that Holloway's people would stop at nothing to silence him. Ethan, for his part, was growing increasingly desperate. He had managed to stay one step ahead of both the FBI and Holloway's allies, but he knew that his luck wouldn't last forever. He had reached out to Sarah Mitchell, the journalist, in a desperate bid to expose Holloway's corruption. Together, they had begun to piece together the puzzle, but the deeper they dug, the more dangerous it became. They were uncovering a web of corruption that reached far beyond Holloway, implicating some of the most powerful people in the city. One evening, as Ethan and Sarah were reviewing the ledger in a dimly lit apartment, they received a warning from one of Sarah's contacts in the FBI. Holloway's people were closing in, and they had hired a professional fixer, a man known only as the Cleaner, to eliminate Ethan and recover the ledger. The Cleaner was a shadowy figure, a former Special Forces operative who had built a reputation for being ruthless and efficient. If he was after Ethan, then time was running out. Ethan and Sarah knew that they had to act fast. They decided to leak portions of the ledger to the press, hoping that the resulting media firestorm would force the authorities to act. But they also knew that leaking the ledger would make them even bigger targets. They needed a plan, a way to ensure that the truth would come out, even if they didn't survive to see it. As they worked through the night, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He had always been cautious, but now every shadow seemed to hold a threat. He knew that Holloway's people were closing in, and he knew that they wouldn't hesitate to kill him if it meant protecting their secrets. The next morning, their worst fears were realized. As Ethan and Sarah were preparing to leave the apartment, they were ambushed by a group of armed men. The Cleaner had found them. A fierce gunfight erupted, and in the chaos, Ethan and Sarah were separated. Ethan managed to escape, but Sarah was captured. The Cleaner's men took her to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, where they began to interrogate her, demanding to know where Ethan was and where he had hidden the ledger. Ethan, now alone and on the run, knew that he had to rescue Sarah. He couldn't let her die because of him. But he also knew that he was walking into a trap. The Cleaner would be expecting him, and Ethan was no match for a trained killer. He needed help, but who could he trust? The FBI was after him, Holloway's people wanted him dead, and anyone he reached out to could be working for the enemy. In a moment of desperation, Ethan decided to take a risk. He reached out to Claire Bennett, the FBI agent who had been hunting him. He knew that it was a long shot, but he also knew that Claire was one of the few people who might be willing to help him. He sent her a cryptic message, offering to turn himself in if she would help him rescue Sarah. Claire was torn. On one hand, Ethan was a fugitive, a thief who had stolen $7 million and was now at the center of a high-stakes game of cat and mouse. On the other hand, she knew that Ethan was the key to bringing down Holloway, and she couldn't let him fall into the hands of the Cleaner. She agreed to meet him, but she also knew that she was walking into a dangerous situation. The Cleaner was a professional, and he wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone who got in his way. The meeting took place in a deserted parking garage. Ethan was nervous, his hand hovering near the gun he had taken from one of the Cleaner's men. Claire arrived alone, her FBI badge prominently displayed. They eyed each other warily, each one trying to gauge the other's intentions. "You've got a lot of nerve, Cole," Claire said, her voice cold. "You steal $7 million, go on the run, and now you want my help?" "I didn't have a choice," Ethan replied, his voice steady. "Holloway's corrupt, and I have the proof. But now Sarah's in danger, and I can't do this alone. I need your help." Claire studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, Cole. I'll help you. But if this is some kind of trick, I'll make sure you regret it." With that, an uneasy alliance was formed. Claire and Ethan began to plan their next move, knowing that they were walking into a deadly confrontation. The Cleaner was holding Sarah at the warehouse, and they knew that he would be expecting them. But they also knew that they had no choice. They had to rescue Sarah and recover the ledger, no matter the cost. As they prepared for the mission, Ethan couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. He had started this journey with the hope of exposing Holloway's corruption, but now he was in over his head. He had become a pawn in a much larger game, a game where the stakes were life and death. But he also knew that he couldn't back down. He had come too far to quit now. The confrontation at the warehouse was a blur of violence and chaos. Claire and Ethan moved quickly and quietly, taking out the Cleaner's men one by one. But the Cleaner was waiting for them, and he was every bit as dangerous as they had feared. A brutal fight ensued, with Ethan and Claire barely managing to hold their own. In the end, it was Ethan who managed to get the upper hand, using his wits and desperation to outmaneuver the cleaner. As the dust settled, Ethan and Claire found Sarah, battered but alive. The ledger was safe, and they had managed to capture the cleaner, who was now in FBI custody. But the victory was bittersweet. They knew that this was only the beginning. Holloway and his allies were still out there, and they would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. As they left the warehouse, Ethan couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. He had exposed Holloway's corruption, but he had also made powerful enemies. The fight was far from over, and he knew that the next act would be even more dangerous. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of relief. They had survived, and the truth was still alive. The aftermath of the warehouse confrontation sent shockwaves through Washington, D.C. The capture of the cleaner, a shadowy figure whose name alone struck fear into the hearts of those who knew of him, was a significant blow to Senator Richard Holloway's network. But the battle was far from over. Holloway and his allies were still at large, and they were more desperate than ever to silence Ethan Cole and destroy the ledger that could bring them all down. Ethan, Claire Bennett, and Sarah Mitchell knew that they had to act quickly. The cleaner's capture had bought them some time, but it had also escalated the stakes. Holloway's allies were now in full damage control mode, using their influence to discredit Ethan and paint him as a rogue intern with a grudge. The media, always eager for a scandal, began to run stories questioning Ethan's motives and the authenticity of the ledger. It was a classic smear campaign designed to muddy the waters and buy Holloway time to cover his tracks. But Ethan, Claire, and Sarah were determined not to let that happen. They had the ledger, and they had the truth. Now, they needed to ensure that it reached the right people who could act on it and bring Holloway to justice. The problem was, they didn't know who they could trust. Holloway's influence extended deep into the FBI, the Justice Department, and even the media. One wrong move, and the ledger could fall into the wrong hands. Claire, leveraging her position within the FBI, began to quietly assemble a team of agents she knew she could trust. These were men and women who had dedicated their careers to fighting corruption, and who were willing to risk everything to see justice done. Together, they began to analyze the ledger, cross-referencing its contents with other evidence they had gathered over the course of their investigation. What they uncovered was staggering: a vast network of bribes, kickbacks, and money laundering that implicated not just Holloway, but dozens of other politicians, lobbyists, and businessmen. But even as they worked, they could feel the noose tightening around them. Holloway's allies were closing in, using every tool at their disposal to track them down. Safe houses were compromised, communications were intercepted, and trusted contacts turned out to be double agents. It was a dangerous game of cat and mouse, with Ethan, Claire, and Sarah always one step ahead, but only just. The turning point came when Claire received a tip from a source within the Justice Department. Holloway, realizing that the ledger was about to go public, had decided to cut his losses. He was planning to flee the country, using his offshore accounts to disappear and live out the rest of his days in luxury. But before he left, he intended to tie up loose ends, starting with Ethan, Claire, and Sarah. Claire knew that they had to act fast. If Holloway escaped, it would be a disaster. Not only would he evade justice, but the ledger's impact would be significantly diminished. They needed to stop him before he could leave the country, but they also needed to ensure that the ledger was made public in a way that couldn't be suppressed. In a daring move, Ethan and Sarah decided to leak the ledger to multiple major news outlets simultaneously. They knew that Holloway's allies would try to block the story, but by flooding the media with the information, they hoped to make it impossible to contain. Claire, meanwhile, focused on stopping Holloway. Using the intelligence they had gathered, she and her team tracked Holloway to a private airfield on the outskirts of the city, where he was preparing to board a plane bound for a country with no extradition treaty. The final confrontation took place under the cover of darkness. Claire and her team moved in just as Holloway's plane was about to take off. A fierce firefight erupted, with Holloway's private security putting up a desperate resistance. But Claire's team was well-trained and determined. They managed to overpower Holloway's guards and take the senator into custody. As Holloway was led away in handcuffs, he glared at Claire with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "You think this changes anything?" he spat. "You think you've won? There are others like me, others who will make sure this never sees the light of day." Claire met his gaze with steely resolve. "Maybe," she said. "But you're done. And we're just getting started." Back in the city, the media storm was already beginning. The leaked ledger had sparked a firestorm of outrage, with headlines screaming about corruption at the highest levels of government. Politicians, lobbyists, and businessmen who had once seemed untouchable were now scrambling to defend themselves. The public demanded answers, and the wheels of justice, long stalled by corruption and influence, began to turn. For Ethan, the resolution was bittersweet. He had achieved what he set out to do, exposing Holloway's corruption and ensuring that the truth came to light. But the cost had been high. He had lost his innocence, his dreams of a career in politics, and any semblance of a normal life. He knew that he would always be looking over his shoulder, always wondering if Holloway's allies would come for him. Sarah, too, felt the weight of what they had done. Her career as a journalist had been catapulted to new heights, but she knew that she had made powerful enemies. She had seen the dark underbelly of power, and it had left a mark on her. As for Claire, she felt a sense of vindication. She had spent her career fighting corruption, and now, finally, she had a major victory to show for it. But she also knew that the fight was far from over. Holloway was just one man, and the system that had enabled him was still in place. There would always be more battles to fight, more corrupt politicians to bring down. In the end, the story of Ethan Cole, the intern who had stolen $7 million from a corrupt politician, became a symbol of hope and defiance. It was a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming power, one person could make a difference. But it was also a cautionary tale, a reminder of the cost of standing up to corruption and the lengths to which those in power would go to protect their interests. As the dust settled and the headlines faded, Ethan, Claire, and Sarah went their separate ways, each carrying the scars of what they had been through. But they also carried the knowledge that they had done the right thing, that they had fought for justice in a world where justice was often in short supply. And in the end, that was enough.